Welcome, nighttime traveler, to sleepy bedtime stories, your haven of stories and tales to help you sleep. This is the place where traditional tales come to life and accompany you on your journey to rest. But first, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know if you're joining me from your bed, from a cozy sofa, or perhaps from some corner of the world where you can still feel the spirit of ancient tales. Please leave me a comment. Every message from you is like a fragment of a precious amphora. If you'd like to support this space of peace and relaxation, subscribe and share the channel so that more people can find their refuge here. And now, take a slow, deep breath, because tonight we're going to dive into another thrilling story.
The Middle Ages, Medieval History. Chapter 1. Castles, Fiefdoms, and Daily Life in Medieval Europe. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let the night envelop you, and allow the words to carry you far away. To an ancient time, unhurried and profound, where the world moved to the rhythm of the seasons, of fire and wind amongst the stone battlements. There is a moment, just before dawn, when the medieval world stands completely still. The darkness is dense and soft at the same time, like a blanket spread over hills not yet named on any modern map. The air smells of damp earth, of firewood slowly dying out in stone hearths, of grass wet with the dew that falls silently upon the fields. Somewhere, an owl lets out its call into the void, and the echo is lost amongst the trees of the forest that surrounds. Imposing and dark, the entire lives of the men and women of this era. We are somewhere in the heart of Europe. The year could be 850 or 920 or 1100. The exact date matters little, because in this world time does not move as it does in ours, in counted seconds and divided hours. Time here flows according to the sun, according to the rain, according to the harvest that comes in or fails. Time is cyclical and ancient, and its rhythms are the same as those of their grandparents, and their grandparents' grandparents, as far back as memory reaches and beyond. In the distance, on a hill overlooking the valley like a sleeping sentinel, rises the silhouette of a castle. It is a dark mass silhouetted against the deep blue sky of the early morning, its square towers pointing towards the stars that still shine faintly before surrendering to the dawn. From here, from this moment, suspended between night and day, the castle seems eternal. It seems to have always been there, as if the earth itself had caused it to grow from its very depths. Stone upon stone, to protect those who live in its shadow. But the castle wasn't always like this. It didn't always have those high limestone walls, those towers with loopholes from which archers could shoot their arrows with little risk of exposure, that drawbridge spanning a moat where the black water reflects the last stars. In the beginning, generations ago, it was just wood and earth, a palisade of sharpened logs atop an artificial mound, a wooden block from which a warrior lord watched over his newly conquered lands. That is how almost all of them began, small, vulnerable, built in haste and fear in times of invasion and chaos. Those were the dark centuries that preceded the world we see today. When the great Roman Empire fragmented, when the legions ceased marching along the cobbled roads and the cities began to empty and fall silent, Europe entered a long period of transformation. It was not a sudden or dramatic collapse, as is sometimes imagined. It was rather a slow slide, like the tide receding very slowly, leaving behind a different landscape, wilder, more uncertain, but also, in its own way, more human and closer to the earth. The great structures of the ancient world dissolved into something new. Cities shrank. Roads became overgrown with weeds. Trade declined. And in that vacuum of power and order, strong men emerged. Warriors who could offer protection in exchange for loyalty and labor. Thus was feudalism born, not as a system planned by any king or philosopher, but as an organic and necessary response to fear and the need for survival. The sun is now beginning to peek over the eastern horizon, coloring the sky with soft hues of ochre and pink, and with its light come the first sounds of the day in the valley. A cock crows in some farmyard, then another, and then, little by little, as if the sound itself were gradually awakening, the murmur of life begins to spread through the small settlement clustered around the base of the castle, inside and outside its outer walls. This village, this community, is the heart of the estate. It is not large, perhaps 100 souls, perhaps a few more, if we count the children who still sleep curled up beside their mothers under coarse woolen blankets. The houses are low, built of wood, mud and straw. Their thatched or reed roofs sag almost to the ground in places, and at night, when the cold bites, the warmth of the animals living in the same space as the humans is welcome, necessary, vital. The estate is a world unto itself. self-sufficient by necessity rather than by choice. Here, rye and wheat are grown in the open fields surrounding the village, divided into long strips that the peasants work with their oxen and their iron-reinforced wooden plows. Here, livestock is raised to provide milk, wool, leather, and meat. Here there is a blacksmith who works the metal by his smoking forge, and a miller who receives the grain and turns it into flour in exchange for a share of the milled grain, and a woman who knows the plants and who cures fevers and aching bones with ointments and concoctions that smell of the forest and of times gone by. Everything belongs to the Lord, or almost everything. The peasants who live on these lands, those who work them from dawn to dusk with their calloused hands and bent backs, receive in return for their labor and loyalty something that, in this world, is worth more than gold: protection. The feudal lord and his men-at-arms are the guarantee that when the enemy horsemen arrive, when the Vikings sail up the river in their dracars with prows curved like serpents, when the Magyars gallop from the east, sowing terror, there will be a place to flee to. There will be walls. There will be men capable of fighting. This exchange, so simple and yet so powerful, is the foundation upon which the entire edifice of the medieval world rests. Protection in exchange for labor. Service in exchange for security. It is a relationship that binds people to the land, to a place, to a lord, in ways that we, from our distance of centuries, may find difficult to fully comprehend. But for those who lived within it, it was simply the natural order of things. It was the way the world worked, and the way it had always worked, as far back as their grandparents could remember. The first light of day has already filled the valley completely, and with it comes work. The peasants emerge from their homes, rubbing their eyes, carrying their tools on their shoulders. A woman lights the fire in the center of the single room that makes up her home, gently blowing on the embers that have survived the night, covered in ash. The smoke rises slowly towards the hole in the roof, and with it rises the smell of bread that will soon begin to bake. That dense, warm scent that permeates every morning at this time of year, and which is, perhaps, the most constant and recognizable smell of the medieval world. At the top of the hill, inside the castle, the day has also begun, though in a different way and at a different pace. The servants move silently through the stone corridors, lighting the torches that line the passageways, carrying water from the well in the inner courtyard to the chambers of the Lord and his family. The guard who has spent the night at the top of the watchtower is relieved by his comrade, who climbs the narrow spiral steps, yawning and with his eyes still half closed. From above, from that stone watchtower that dominates the entire horizon, the awakening world seems small and orderly, like a map that someone has spread out on the ground with every element occupying its precise place. The castle as we see it at this dawn of the 11th or 12th century is already quite different from that first wooden palisade we mentioned earlier. The transition from wood to stone was one of the great changes in medieval architecture, and took place gradually during the 9th and 10th centuries, accelerated by necessity and the resources available. Stone was expensive and difficult to work with. It required specialist stonemasons, engineers who knew the secrets of the arch and the vault, and vast numbers of laborers who had to be fed and housed during months or years of construction. But stone was also indestructible in a way that wood could not be. It did not burn. It did not rot in the rain. It withstood the impact of battering rams and projectiles launched by siege engines. A well-built stone castle could withstand a siege for months, turning resistance into attrition, into a waiting game, into a gamble that the besieging army would tire or run out of supplies before the defenders. And so, one by one, the wooden castles were gradually replaced or extended with stone walls. First, the main tower, the keep, that square or cylindrical structure which was the heart and last refuge of the fortress. Then the outer walls. Then the additional corner towers, which allowed the defenders to shoot arrows in all directions without blind spots. Then the moat, the barbican, the drawbridge, the loopholes, the machicolations from which boiling oil or stones could be poured onto the attackers closing in on the base of the walls. Every architectural feature was a response to a specific threat, an ingenious solution to a military problem that someone had learned the hard way, often through bloodshed. The medieval castle was, in this sense, a constantly evolving feat of engineering, a permanent dialogue between the art of attack and the art of defense, between destructive creativity and protective creativity. But the castle was not just a fortress. It was also a home, an administrative center, a symbol of power and identity. And understanding this is essential to grasping what life was like inside, because the castle housed not only warriors, but also families, servants, artisans, priests, musicians, cooks, laundresses, stable hands, and the whole complex human community needed to keep that world running day by day. The Great Hall is the heart of the castle as a social and political space. It is a huge stone room with a ceiling supported by oak beams darkened by years of smoke, and in the center, or against one of the long walls, a gigantic hearth where whole logs burn, illuminating the space with a flickering, warm light. The walls are partly covered in tapestries, those large woven fabrics depicting hunting scenes, battles or sacred stories, which are not merely decoration but also insulation against the cold that seeps relentlessly through the stone in winter. Around long, unplaned wooden tables, the Lord and his men gather twice a day for the main meals. The order in which each person sits matters greatly. The Lord presides from the head of the table, in the position of greatest honor, with his wife at his side. His knights and distinguished visitors sit closer to the Lord, whilst the servants and men of lower rank occupy the lower ends. This seating hierarchy is visible, legible, constantly brought to the minds of all present as an expression of the social order that structures their world. The food is plentiful for those near the center of power, and much more modest for those further away. The Lord and his principal guests eat roast meat, game birds, fish on days of religious abstinence, and cakes made from imported spices that arrive from the east via long and costly trade routes. The bread is white and fine, made from well-sifted flour. The wine comes from warmer regions to the south, stored in barrels in the castle cellars. For servants and lower-ranking workers, the table offers vegetable stews, dense and slightly sour black rye bread, porridge made from oats or barley, and mature cheese. It is not a tasteless meal, but neither is it the abundance that the nobility serves up without a second thought, is greater than it is the food of those who work, sufficient to sustain the body in its labors, not particularly designed for pleasure. And yet, there are moments when the distinction is partially blurred, when the great hall becomes a space for shared celebration. The feasts of the Christian calendar, weddings, baptisms, military victories, these occasions bring together the entire castle community and sometimes also the peasants of the fiefdom in a collective celebration where people drink more than they should. Listen to the tales of the minstrel or troubadour who has arrived from distant lands with new stories, and the music of lutes, bagpipes and drums fills the hall until late into the night. The minstrel is a figure who deserves a moment's pause, because he embodies something important about how information and entertainment flowed in this world without a printing press, without abundant paper, without books within the reach of the majority. Most people in the Middle Ages could neither read nor write. It was not stupidity or backwardness. It was simply that there had never been a need or an opportunity to learn. Culture, knowledge, stories and history itself were passed on by word of mouth, in songs, in tales, in poems that minstrels and troubadours memorized, refined and carried from court to court, from village to village, sowing the world with words that traveled further than any written document. The minstrel visiting the castle tonight knows tales of Charlemagne and his champions, of Roland and Oliveros at the pass of Roncesvalles, of Arthur and his knights seated around a round table where all were equal. He also knows love songs, those soft, melancholic melodies that speak of ladies in towers and knights who serve without hope of reward, which the troubadours of southern France have been perfecting for generations until they became a philosophy and an art of sublimated desire. These stories matter because they shape how the nobility sees itself, what ideal it aspires to, what it means to be a knight in this world. The code of chivalry is not merely a set of military rules. It is a complex and sometimes contradictory ethic that seeks to reconcile the violence inherent in the profession of arms with the values of honor, loyalty, the protection of the weak, and service to God. It is an extraordinarily sophisticated cultural construct to have emerged in such a frequently brutal world, and reflects the constant tension running through medieval society as a whole, between the ideal and reality, between what one wishes to be and what circumstances compel one to do. In this mental universe, the knight is the linchpin around which much of what matters revolves. His training begins in childhood, when a noble boy of 7 or 8 is sent, according to custom, to another lord's castle to serve as a page. There he learns the basic skills, horse riding, the use of weapons, the rules of protocol and courtesy. At around the age of 14, he becomes a squire, the personal assistant to an adult knight, and over the next 7 years, he learns his trade in practice, tending to his lord's weapons and armor, accompanying him on campaigns, observing how a man of honor behaves in situations that test his courage and judgment. And finally comes the investiture ceremony, that solemn and highly significant moment when the young squire is knighted. It may take place in the castle chapel, kneeling before the altar after a whole night of vigil and prayer, or it may take place on the battlefield, in the heat and chaos of combat, when a lord touches the shoulders of a squire with his sword, a squire who has just demonstrated his valor in the most direct and definitive way possible. In both cases, the transformation is complete and permanent. The young man has entered the order of consecrated warriors, and his life, from that moment on, is dedicated to arms, to the Lord to whom he has sworn allegiance, and to the service of God and the Church. As the morning progresses in the castle, whilst the Lord receives his stewards and listens to reports on the harvests, the taxes collected, the disputes between peasants requiring his arbitration. On the ramparts, the soldiers on guard watch the horizon, with eyes trained to detect any anomaly. A horseman moving too quickly, a column of smoke that ought not to be there, the glint of the sun on metal that does not belong to any peaceful villager. Life on the ramparts is a labor of patience and monotony, punctuated by moments of extreme tension. The men who guard the castle come from very diverse backgrounds. Some are young knights who do not yet own land and serve in exchange for lodging, food, and the hope of one day receiving their own fiefdom. Others are mercenaries, men who have made war their profession and who serve whoever pays, with no fixed loyalties beyond money and custom. There are also expert crossbowmen, specialists whose training differs from that of the mounted knight, whose skill with the bow or crossbow is a crucial tactical advantage for which the lords pay well. Let us now descend from the ramparts, from that lofty, distant vantage point, and walk towards the village that stretches out at the foot of the castle. Here, in this life closer to the earth, we shall find the true heart of the medieval world, for the vast majority of people living in this era were peasants, not warriors or nobles. 90 out of every 100 people, if we could count them, lived off the land, subject to the relentless rhythms of the seasons and the weight of feudal obligations. Mourning in the village is a world of constant, specialized labor. The peasant who sets out at dawn for the fields carries with him not only his body and his tools, but also a profound knowledge accumulated over generations of the land he works. He knows which field needs to lie fallow this year and which can be sown. He knows how to prepare the soil depending on whether he is planting winter wheat or spring barley. He knows how to read the sky with a precision that no meteorological book can match, because his survival and that of his family depend on that reading. The farming system that dominated medieval Europe at this time was the three-field system, an innovation which, although it may seem modest, transformed agriculture and, with it, the continent's ability to feed a growing population. The arable fields surrounding each village are divided into 3 sectors, one sown with winter grain, another sown with spring grain or vegetables, and a third left fallow, that is to say, uncultivated during that year to allow the soil to recover. Each year, the sectors rotate so that no land is completely exhausted and productivity remains stable or even improves over time. This system was not invented by any enlightened agronomist, nor ordered by any king. It arose from practical experimentation through the trial and error of generations of peasants who observed their land and learned from it. And its widespread adoption during the 8th and 9th centuries constituted one of the most important silent revolutions in European history, because it made it possible to feed more mouths, free up some labor for other trades, and lay the foundations for the population growth that characterized the centuries that followed. The peasant woman plays a role that goes far beyond the confines of her small home. She works in the fields alongside her husband and children at times of greatest need, especially during sowing and harvesting, when every pair of hands is indispensable. But she is also the homemaker, who decides how the scarce grain reserves are distributed throughout the year, who knows which roots and berries from the forest are edible and which are poisonous, who cures children's fevers with herbal poultices and the warmth of her body on winter nights. In the village there are also craftsmen who do not work the land directly, or who do so only to a limited extent. Is greater than the blacksmith is essential. His iron tools make agriculture, construction, and warfare possible. He works in his forge from dawn, surrounded by heat and noise, hammering the glowing metal with a rhythm that can be heard throughout the village like a constant, steady pulse. The carpenter builds and repairs houses, cart wheels, tool handles, the beams that support the roofs. The tanner works the leather that becomes shoes, belts, bags, harnesses for draft animals. All these trades are organized within the framework of the fiefdom, subject to the Lord's obligations and regulations. The blacksmith, for example, will pay a portion of his wages in service to the Lord by forging tools or weapons when required. The miller, as we have already mentioned, takes a portion of the grain he mills. The Lord's baker holds a monopoly on the communal ovens, and peasants wishing to bake their own bread will either pay to use these ovens or take their dough to the Lord's oven in exchange for a portion of the baked goods. This system of seigneurial monopolies, which historians call the banales, the seigneury of banality, may seem exploitative from our perspective, and undoubtedly was so in many ways. But it must also be understood in its context. Building a stone mill or a communal oven required an investment that no individual peasant could afford. The Lord provided the infrastructure and charged for it. The relationship was unequal, certainly, but it was not necessarily arbitrary or without internal logic. Midday arrives with the sun high in the sky and a brief break from work in the fields. The peasants seek the shade of a tree or head home if they are nearby, and eat frugally bread, cheese, an onion, fresh water from the stream. The children who have spent the morning tending the livestock or scaring birds away from the crops return too, their bare feet covered in dust from the road. The village breathes for a moment, pauses, collects itself. This midday pause also has a deeper significance in the medieval daily calendar, because time in this world is deeply marked by the rhythm of the canonical hours, that system of prayer which divides the day into segments according to the Christian monastic tradition. Prime at dawn, terce mid-morning, is greater than sexta at midday, nona in the early afternoon, vespers at dusk, compline before sleep. The tolling of the village church bells, that small stone structure, the only building comparable in solidity to the humblest of houses, marks these hours and reminds everyone that they live within an order greater than the merely human. The church is omnipresent in the medieval world in a way that is difficult to imagine for those of us who live in secularized societies. It is not merely that most people sincerely believe in God, in the saints, in heaven and hell. It is that religion is the lens through which everything is interpreted. Illness and healing, rain and drought, war and peace, birth and death. There is no sphere of human experience in this world that lies outside religious explanation, that is not connected in some way to the divine will or to the forces of good and evil that are constantly vying for control of reality. The village priest is an ambivalent and fascinating figure. In theory, he is God's representative in this small community, the guardian of the sacraments that mark the milestones of life: baptism, marriage, last rites. In practice, he is often a man who can barely read the Latin he recites from memory at Mass, who lives off the land like his parishioners, who sometimes has a wife and children despite the ecclesiastical rules that forbid it, who is as much a part of the village in all its human aspects as any of its other inhabitants. And yet, he possesses something that no one else in the village possesses: access to the sacraments, the ability to intercede between humans and the divine, knowledge, however imperfect, of the Church's written tradition. In a world where the written word is almost exclusively the domain of the clergy, the priest, however modest he may be, carries with him something of the aura of that knowledge which distinguishes the literate world from the illiterate. Higher up in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, in the cathedrals of cities that have grown slowly over the centuries, and in the great monasteries that serve as centers of learning and written culture, the medieval church attained a grandeur and complexity that stand in stark contrast to the village life we have just explored. Benedictine monasteries, following the rule that Saint Benedict of Nursia wrote in the 6th century, are communities of men or women who have renounced the outside world to devote their lives to God through prayer and work. ora et labora, pray and work. That is the principle that structures their day, divided precisely between religious services and practical activities. And amongst these practical activities, one of the most important and precious to us, the heirs to their work, is the copying and preservation of manuscripts. In the monastery's scriptorium, that quiet, light-filled room where the copyist monks spend hours bent over their parchments with quill pens in hand, a task of cultural preservation of incalculable importance is being carried out. Without the medieval scriptoria, without the patience and dedication of those men in dark robes with ink-stained hands, much of the literature and thought of classical antiquity would have been lost forever. They copy the sacred texts. Naturally, the Bible, the commentaries of the Church Fathers, the hymns and liturgical texts. But they also copied Virgil and Ovid, Cicero and Pliny the Elder, the Greek philosophers whose works have come down to us in translations or fragments. They copied books on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. They copy chronicles and histories. And in copying, and sometimes adding their own marginal notes, their comments and corrections, they actively participate in the transmission and transformation of knowledge, not as mere instruments of copying, but as intellectuals who think, doubt, and contribute. Evening falls upon the estate as the sun declines towards the west, its light casting a golden hue over the fields of ripe grain in summer, or a cold silver over the frozen ground in the depths of winter. Work in the fields continues until the light allows, and when darkness begins to spread from the east, the peasants gather up their tools and return to the village with the slow, heavy gait of those who have expended all their energy in physical labor. Afternoons are short in winter and very long in summer. In winter, night falls on the village very early, and the peasant family gathers round the hearth fire, whilst outside the cold bites and the wind howls beneath the thatched eaves. Winter tasks are different: mending tools, carding wool, spinning, weaving, preparing seeds for the next sowing. Winter is also the time for stories, for long conversations by the fire, for the tales of the elders who recall difficult years and good years, for the songs that will also be sung the following summer is less than is greater than passed on from voice to voice, from generation to generation. In summer, the long afternoon invites us to work longer, but also to gather in the village square as the sun sets. Young people court one another with glances and laughter. The elders discuss the news brought by some traveler. The children run and shout in the gentle warmth of the evening. Medieval life, especially in its rural forms, has a very intense communal dimension which we, in our world of closed doors and individual screens, have largely lost. Privacy was an unattainable luxury for most. People lived in the constant presence of others. They often slept in the same room with the whole family, and sometimes with domestic animals too. They worked and ate and laughed and cried in full view of their neighbors. This lack of privacy had consequences for psychology and culture that historians have debated at length. It created very strong community bonds, an interdependence that also served as a safety net. When a family lost their harvest to hail or fire, neighbors contributed whatever they could. When someone fell seriously ill, the community rallied to help. This solidarity was neither idyllic nor free from conflict, envy and malice, like any human community, but it was real and essential for collective survival. The castle, meanwhile, has also had its own afternoon of work and preparations. The feudal lord received a messenger today from another neighboring nobleman with whom he is in dispute over the boundaries of their respective lands. The message arrived written in Latin by the other lord's chaplain, and the castle's own chaplain read it aloud and explained its contents. The reply will be considered over supper, discussed with the lord's advisors, and then carefully dictated by the chaplain, who wields the quill with the dexterity afforded by his ecclesiastical training. These disputes over land and boundaries are a daily occurrence in feudal politics and are rarely straightforward. Land rights in the medieval world form a complex web of customs, local traditions, inherited privileges, royal grants and private agreements that sometimes contradict one another in ways that no modern legal system would tolerate. There are no precise land registers, and field boundaries are often marked by reference to features of the landscape that change over time: a fallen tree, a stream that has changed course, a stone that someone has moved. Resolving these disputes sometimes required the intervention of the superior feudal lord, the bishop, or even the king, a figure who, in this era, often exercised power that was more symbolic than effective. The medieval king is not an absolute sovereign in the modern sense. He is rather first among equals, the apex of a pyramid of loyalties that is not always stable, the guarantor of an order that depended as much on his negotiating skills and personal charisma as on his military strength. A king who loses the trust of his principal vassals could find himself in an extremely precarious position. As medieval history repeatedly illustrates with dramatic examples, night has already fallen over the fiefdom as supper is served in the castle's great hall. Torches and candles illuminate the faces of the diners with that warm, flickering light that makes everything seem more dramatic, closer, more human. The Lord presides, and seated to his right tonight is the messenger who arrived at dusk, who will be offered hospitality for the duration of his stay. For hospitality is in this world an almost sacred duty, a principle that takes precedence over many practical considerations. The food is good tonight. A wild boar hunted yesterday in the Lord's forest has reached the castle kitchen, and the cook has prepared it with spices, including cinnamon and ginger, brought from the east at some point in the long trade chain which, though weakened, has never ceased to function entirely throughout these medieval centuries. There is also freshly baked white bread, mature cheese from the cellar, and last year's wine stored in barrels that adorn a corner of the hall. In the village, dinner is more modest. The pot that has been hanging over the fire since this morning contains a thick vegetable stew, a piece of salted bacon for flavor, perhaps some vegetables picked from the family garden. The bread is dark and dense. The water comes from the stream or the communal well. And yet, this supper also has its own dignity, its own ritual of sharing, its own moment of pause and gratitude before the family retires to sleep. Sleep in the medieval world comes early because darkness falls, and darkness, in the absence of artificial light, is a far more decisive boundary than in our world of omnipresent electricity. When the sun sets and the candles are extinguished to save money, the darkness is total and profound, and the bodies that have been working since dawn need no invitation to surrender to rest. But before going to sleep, there is one final ritual that many historians have found fascinating, and which reminds us just how different the experience of sleep was in medieval times. There is evidence that during this period, the norm was not to sleep for a solid 8 hours, as we do, but in 2 periods separated by an hour or 2 of wakefulness in the middle of the night. The first sleep began at dusk and lasted until around midnight. Then came the intermediate period of wakefulness, during which people would get up, chat with those sleeping nearby, pray, make love, think, and then came the second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This biphasic sleep pattern, as specialists call it, was so normal that medieval texts mention it with the same naturalness with which we mention any other aspect of daily routine. It only began to disappear with the spread of artificial lighting. First gas, street lamps, and then electricity, which extended the productive period of the day and gradually compressed sleep into the single block we now consider normal. And so we return to the early hours, to the moment of stillness with which we began this tour of the medieval stronghold. The castle sleeps. The village sleeps. The sentinels on the ramparts remain standing, their solitary figures silhouetted against the starry sky. watching over a horizon that offers no threats tonight. The forest surrounding the stronghold breathes in the darkness, filled with the small, nocturnal sounds of the animals that inhabit it. The river flows in the distance as it always has, and as it will continue to flow. There is something eternal about this image, something that transcends the specific time period we have been exploring. The desire to protect oneself, to belong to a community, to work and rest in tune with the rhythm of nature, to tell stories around the fire before darkness carries consciousness off to sleep. These things are not merely medieval. They are human in a very deep and very ancient way. The castle stone retains the day's warmth even on the coldest nights, and beneath that stone, in the Lord's chambers, in the servants' communal dormitories, in the haylofts where some young men have settled amongst the straw and the warmth of the horses, bodies rest and dreams begin. They are dreams we do not know, dreams that were lost with the dreamers centuries ago, but which undoubtedly contained the same things as all human dreams, desires, fears, images of the day that has just passed, omens of the day to come. And in the village, in that little mud and straw house where the peasant family has huddled together under coarse woolen blankets, sleep has also come. The children sleep soundly, with that total surrender to rest that is unique to young bodies that have been running and playing all day, is greater than the parents sleep more lightly, alert even in their dreams to the sounds of the night, to a child's cry, to the noise of an animal that ought not be near the farmyard. The priest of the small stone church has finished his compline, the last prayer of the day, and closes the liturgical book with the customary bow. He extinguishes the altar candle. He steps out into the cold of the night to gaze at the sky for a moment, and the stars return that gaze with their cold, impassive magnificence. He goes back inside, wraps himself in his cloak, and lies down on the straw mattress that serves as his bed, perhaps thinking of next Sunday's sermon, on the words he will use to speak of divine mercy to the men and women who work their Lord's land, and who, in the darkest moments of the long winter, need more than ever for someone to remind them that there is an order in the universe that goes beyond the rain and the harvest. The whole estate sleeps now, sleeps and breathes, and in that collective sleep, energy is stored for the day to come, just like this one, and yet different from it, with its labors and its breaks, its conversations and its silences, its small triumphs and its small sorrows, the endless procession of days we call history when we look at them from afar, but which are simply life when lived from within. The castle's stones guard this silence with the patience of the inorganic, which feels neither cold nor heat nor the passing of time. They were built by men who are no longer here and will be inhabited by men not yet born. They are the visible continuity between the past and the future, the fixed point around which human time revolves in its cycles of generations. And the forest, that forest which surrounds the manor and which we have mentioned several times as a dark and ever-present boundary, continues to breathe in the night with its own ancient and indifferent life. It is the realm of the wild, of the unknown, the space that lies beyond the control of the Lord and the church and the community. Dangerous animals dwell there. Certainly, bears and wolves and wild boars that can destroy a crop or attack an unsuspecting child. But it is also home, according to the medieval imagination, to beings of another order, the spirits of the forest, the fairies, the ghosts of the dead who have found no rest. This boundary between the orderly world of the manor and the disorderly world of the forest is also a psychological and cultural boundary of enormous importance. The manor represents civilization, work, divine order. The forest represents chaos, the pagan, that which lies beyond the reach of the cross. And yet, the manor needs the forest. It needs its timber for building and for heating, its animals for food, its plants for healing. The relationship between the ordered world and the wild world is one of mutual dependence, of constant tension, of ongoing negotiation between what is controlled and what cannot and is not intended to be fully controlled. This tension, which runs through the whole of medieval culture in ways that go far beyond mere geography, is one of the keys to understanding the world we are exploring. A world that is neither as dark nor as bright as the most extreme caricatures portray it. A world that undoubtedly has its horrors, endemic violence, extremely high infant mortality, famines that decimate entire populations, epidemics that strike without warning and take the young and the old alike, the harshness of relentless agricultural labor, but also a world that has its own beauties, its profound rhythms, its sense of community and belonging, its forms of joy found in the songs of the troubadours and in the illuminations of manuscripts and in the soaring, perfect forms of the cathedrals that would begin to be built in the centuries to come. A world that, in its own way, knew how to create beauty and meaning amidst hardship, because that too is an inherently human capacity that no era, however dark it may be, can completely extinguish. The night deepens. The stars turn slowly above the sleeping castle, above the sleeping village, above the forest that never sleeps entirely. Somewhere a river flows towards the sea, Somewhere else, a child is born tonight, and its cry breaks the silence of a small house where an exhausted and happy mother welcomes it into her arms. And somewhere else still, someone dies in peace, surrounded by their loved ones, having received the last rites in their soul, according to their faith, on its way to that which has been the invisible horizon of their whole life. This is the Middle Ages. Not the monstrous, dark age we sometimes imagine, nor the paradise of knights and maidens we sometimes idealize, but something far more interesting and closer to us than we realize, a world of human beings who were born, loved, suffered, laughed, built, destroyed, sang and died, just like us, only within a different order of things from our own, with different beliefs, with different tools, with different fears and different hopes. And their castles still stand. Their cathedrals still raise their spires towards the sky. Their songs, in fragments, have reached our ears. Their words, patiently copied by hands that are now dust, still fill the pages of the oldest books in our libraries. They are closer to us than the distance of the centuries would have us believe. And when we take the time to listen to them, to look at what they left behind, we can still hear the echo of their voices in the stone and in the parchment and in the collective memory that defines us. Close your eyes. Let the sound of that distant world slowly dissolve into the silence of your night. The castle stones grow cold. The fire in the peasant's hearth dies down to embers. The stars continue their slow, steady course. And somewhere, far away in time, the men and women of the Middle Ages sleep too, just like you, just like everyone, beneath the same endless sky full of promise. Sleep well. The Middle Ages, Medieval History. Chapter 2, Knights, Monasteries and the Cultural Legacy of the Middle Ages. There are places in the world where time seems to have stood still. Places where stones hold secrets, where the wind through the arches of a cathedral sounds almost like a prayer, where the grass grows soft and silent over what was once a battlefield. If you stand still long enough, if you close your eyes and let the cool morning air envelop you, you can almost hear them. The footsteps of monks on the cold stone floor, the distant clang of metal on the anvil, the rustling of the pages of a book illustrated with gold and lapis lazuli. The Middle Ages did not die. They simply fell asleep within their own stones, waiting for someone to stop and listen, Tonight we journey to that world, a world that was neither dark nor simple, though for centuries it was portrayed as such. It was a world full of beautiful contradictions, of men who prayed at dawn and wielded the sword at dusk, of women who embroidered tapestries by day and copied manuscripts by candlelight at night, of kings who feared God more than they feared their enemies, and of peasants who found beauty in the land they worked, though that land never belonged to them. It was a deeply human world. Imagine waking up in the year 1100, somewhere in the heart of France, perhaps in the Champagne region, where vineyards stretch across gentle hills beneath a pearl-grey sky. The air smells of damp wood and freshly baked bread. From somewhere nearby comes the sound of a bell, deep and slow, marking the service of Lauds, the first prayer of the day. It is 6 o'clock in the morning. The sun is just peeking over the horizon, tinging the clouds with a soft, delicate pink. And at the heart of that landscape, like an island of tranquility amidst the noisy world, stands the monastery. Its limestone walls are so thick that it is always cool inside, even in summer. The arches of its central cloister cast perfect shadows upon the cobbled floor. In the inner gardens grow medicinal herbs, lavender, rosemary, sage, thyme, plants whose scent fills the air with an almost supernatural calm. This is the heart of the medieval world, not the castle, not the battlefield, the monastery. Since the 5th century, when the Roman Empire crumbled like a building whose foundations had been removed, the church had been the institution that held Western civilization together. Whilst the Germanic kingdoms fought over territories with sword and fire, whilst the great Roman cities emptied and the roads became overgrown with weeds, the monasteries burned like beacons in the darkness. They preserved knowledge. They passed on culture. They fed the poor. They healed the sick. They educated the children. It was no small thing. It was almost everything. And it was a man born around the year 480 inches, the region of Latium, south of Rome, who laid the foundations of that monastic life that would define the medieval world for centuries. His name was Benedict of Nursia. Is greater than a young man from a wealthy family who one day decided to abandon his studies in Rome, horrified by the corruption and frivolity he saw around him, and to go off alone into the mountains to live as a hermit. He sought no power. He sought no fame. He sought silence. He sought God in the stillness of the rocks and the forest. For 3 years he lived in a cave near Subiaco, fed by a monk who lowered bread to him in a basket tied to a rope. Then, little by little, other men began to follow him. They wanted what he had. That peace, that clarity, and Benedict realized that the spiritual path did not have to be traveled in solitude. It could be walked in community, with clear rules, with rhythm, with purpose. Thus was the Benedictine rule born. The rule of Saint Benedict was, in essence, a manual for life. It divided the monk's day into 3 equal parts: prayer, work, and rest. Ora et labora. Pray and work. 8 times a day, the monastery bell called the monks to stop what they were doing and go to the choir to sing the psalms. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline at dusk. Time was not their own. Time belonged to God, and every hour was consecrated to Him. But between those hours of prayer, the monks worked, and that work was varied and diverse. There were those who tilled the land, those who tended the stables, those who cooked and those who cleaned. And there were those who did something that would change the course of history. They copied books. Stop for a moment and think about what that meant. In the scriptorium, the room set aside for copying manuscripts, the monks sat for hours on wooden benches, bent over parchments, patiently prepared from lamb or calf skin. Before them, on a lectern, lay the original text they had to reproduce letter by letter, word by word. In their hands, a bird quill cut with precision, carefully dipped into horn inkwells filled with black or red ink. And on their tables, sometimes tiny containers of gold or lapis lazuli powder to illuminate the initial letters with breathtaking beauty. The cold in winter was brutal. Their fingers went numb. Their eyes ached from the strain of deciphering Latin texts by the flickering light of a candle. And yet, they did it. They copied Virgil and Cicero. They copied the Gospels and the letters of St. Paul. They copied treatises on medicine, on astronomy, on philosophy. They copied Augustine of Hippo and Gregory the Great. And in doing so, they saved those words from oblivion. Without those anonymous monks bent over their parchments in the darkness of the early Middle Ages, much of classical Latin literature would have disappeared forever. There is something deeply moving about that. In imagining the hands of an anonymous monk in some 7th century Irish monastery, meticulously copying Virgil's verses without knowing exactly who that man had been, without knowing that those poems had been written more than 700 years earlier, but feeling that they were worth preserving because they were beautiful, because they spoke a truth about the human condition, because beauty must not be lost even if the world crumbles around them. Ireland played an extraordinary role in this work of preservation. Whilst the European continent burned under the invasions of the Vandals, Visigoths, Huns, and Ostrogoths, the islands at the western edge of the known world remained relatively peaceful. And in that calm, Irish monks created some of the most beautiful manuscripts the world has ever seen. The most famous of all, the Book of Kells, was created around the year 800, probably at the monastery of Iona, on the Scottish island of the same name. Its pages are covered with illustrations of such complexity and delicacy that modern experts wonder how it was possible to produce them without a magnifying glass, without precision tools, with nothing but infinite patience and unshakable faith. But monasteries were not merely places of study and contemplation. They were also economic centers, hospitals, schools, and shelters. The abbot, the leader of the community, was often a figure as powerful as any feudal lord. The great abbeys owned vast estates, forests, mills, farms, workshops. They traded in wine, cheese, wool, and parchment. They attracted pilgrims who came to venerate the relics of the saints. And those pilgrims needed food, lodging, and medical care when they fell ill on the way. The monasteries provided these for them. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the sound, Gregorian chant flowing from the abbey church into the cloister garden, a melody without instruments, just human voices rising and falling in a line of pure serenity. Gregorian chant is named after Pope Gregory I, who reigned from 590 to 604, and who standardized and codified this style of liturgical chant. It is not music to move the body. It is music to calm the mind, to take the consciousness to a more serene place, deeper, quieter. Whoever listens to it in the right place, in a stone church with high ceilings and bare walls, feels that time stands still. That music, those stones, that silence, all of it was part of a deliberate project. Romanesque architecture, which dominated Western Europe between the 10th and 12th centuries was the material expression of that world. Its churches and cathedrals were not ornamental. They were theological. Every arch, every column, every mosaic had a meaning, told a story, taught a truth to the faithful, the vast majority of whom could not read. The carved tympanums above the church portals depicted the Last Judgment with a vividness that made one tremble. The figures of saints on the column capitals served as a constant reminder that other men and women had found the path to the sacred. The architectural space was itself a sermon in stone. And then, in the 12th century, something changed. Master builders began to experiment, to take risks, to push the boundaries of what was possible with stone is greater than. They discovered that if they distributed the weight of the vault differently, if they used pointed arches instead of semicircular ones, if they invented external structures, the flying buttresses, to support the lateral thrust of the walls, they could build higher, much higher, and they could open up the walls, which previously had to be solid and blind to bear the weight, and fill them with stained glass. Thus was Gothic architecture born, and it was born in a specific place, at a specific moment. In the year 1144, Abbot Suger consecrated the new chancel of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis on the outskirts of Paris, in a ceremony attended by bishops from all over France. That chancel was unlike anything that had been built before. Light streamed in from all sides, filtered through stained glass windows that painted the air blue, red, green, and gold. The pillars were slender as spears. The space seemed weightless. Abbot Suger himself wrote of that experience of light as a spiritual experience, as a glimpse of the divine. Material light, he said, is the reflection of the uncreated light that is God. Over the next 100 years, this new architecture spread across Europe like a wave. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Bourges in France, Cologne, Strasbourg, Magdeburg in the Holy Roman Empire, Leon, Burgos, Toledo on the Iberian Peninsula, Canterbury, Lincoln, Salisbury in England. Gothic cathedrals rose on the horizon of medieval cities like cliffs of stone and light, visible from miles away, dominating the urban landscape with an unrivaled presence. Building them took decades, sometimes centuries. Several generations of craftsmen and laborers who began a cathedral knew they would not live to see it completed. They worked for their children and their children's children, and for the glory of God. That alone says a great deal about how they conceived of time and the meaning of existence. But let us leave for a moment the stones and the silence of the monasteries and walk out into the open, towards the fields and the castles, towards the noisy, dusty world of knights. If the monastery was the spiritual heart of the Middle Ages, the castle was its center of power, and the knights were the force that drove that power, the energy that maintained order or disorder in the feudal world is greater than the figure of the medieval knight is one of the most recognizable in all of human history, steeped in legend and symbolism, in romanticism and violence. It is worth understanding it in all its complexity, stripped of the embellishments added by later centuries, to grasp what it truly was. The medieval knight was, first and foremost, a warrior on horseback. The word knight derives precisely from horse, and that defines almost everything. In an era when combat decided who lived and who ruled, the warrior mounted on a great warhorse, clad in metal armor, was the most powerful weapon in existence. A group of knights charging at full gallop was practically unstoppable for poorly equipped infantry. They were the heavy cavalry, the military elite of feudalism. But becoming a knight required years of preparation. The process began in childhood. At the age of 7 or 8, the son of a nobleman was sent to the court of another, more powerful lord as a page. There he learnt the basics of court life. He served at table, looked after the horses, accompanied the knights on their travels. He learnt obedience, courtesy, the basics of reading and writing, perhaps a little Latin. But above all, he observed. He observed how the men behaved whom he hoped one day to become. At around the age of 14, the page was promoted to squire. Now his training became more intense. He learned to wield the sword, the lance, the shield. He learned to ride in every possible condition, in full armor, at a gallop, with a lance at the ready. He learned to care for and maintain his lord's weapons and armor, to help him dress for battle, to follow him onto the battlefield and retrieve his body if he fell. It was a brutal education, physically demanding, emotionally formative. The squires who survived it and many did not, emerged as men capable of withstanding the terror of combat. And finally, the moment of investiture arrived. The ceremony of knighthood. In its simplest form, a more senior knight would touch the candidate on the shoulder with the flat of his sword and utter the words that elevated him to that status. In its most elaborate form, the ceremony stretched over several days. The candidate spent the night awake in the church, in solitary prayer before the altar. At dawn, he bathed as a sign of purification. He was then armed, piece by piece. The golden spurs, the chainmail, the helmet, the sword, the shield. Each piece had its symbolic meaning. The sword, an instrument of justice and not merely of violence. The shield, defense of the weak. The golden spurs, a symbol of the nobility of spirit that was to guide his life. That nobility of spirit had a name, chivalry. And chivalry was, in theory, a moral code that was to govern the warrior's life. Its roots are manifold. They stemmed from the Germanic warrior tradition, with its emphasis on personal valor and loyalty to the Lord. They stemmed from the Christian Church, which, since the 10th century, had sought to channel the violence of that warrior class towards ends it deemed legitimate: the defense of the faith, the protection of the poor and pilgrims, the fight against the infidels. And they came from a literary and poetic culture that flourished in the south of France from the 11th century onwards. The culture of the troubadours and courtly love. The troubadours, those fascinating figures who roamed the castles and courts of southern France, of Catalonia and the courts of northern Italy, singing their songs in the Occitan language, the language that today survives only as a dialect in small Provençal communities. The troubadours invented something new. They invented the idea of romantic love as Western culture has known it ever since. Love as a force that ennobles the lover. Love as a spiritual quest. Love as a flame that purifies the soul even if it is never reciprocated, or precisely because it cannot be. The central figure of troubadour lyric poetry was the lady, the domna in Provençal. She was always a noblewoman, usually married to another man, unattainable by definition. The troubadour knight loved her in secret, or rather loved her in poetry, which was the same thing and yet something completely different. He dedicated his verses to her, his deeds, his victories in the tournament. He offered her a service of love, a vassalage of the heart that mimicked feudal vassalage, and that lady remained serene and inaccessible, like an ideal, like a distant star that guided the traveler without him ever being able to reach her. It is a strange ideal for our modern sensibilities, but it had an immense influence on Western culture. For from that Provençal tradition sprang the great chivalric romances of the 12th and 13th centuries. The tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, written in French by Chrétien de Troyes around the year 1170. The tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, of Tristan and Isolde, of Percival and the Holy Grail. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were the narrative embodiment of chivalric values, courage, courtesy, loyalty, impassable love, the quest for something sacred beyond the visible world. The Holy Grail, that mysterious object whose quest forms the basis of much of Arthurian narrative. In some versions, it is the chalice used by Jesus at the Last Supper. In others, the vessel in which Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood of Christ on the cross. In the most mystical version, that of the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach in his Times Parzival, written around the year 1200, the Grail is a celestial stone brought to earth by angels who took no part in the war between God and Lucifer. Whatever the case may be, the Grail always represents the same thing: unattainable perfection, the source of all meaning and fulfillment that man ceaselessly seeks yet can never fully possess. It is a metaphor for the human condition so powerful that you still cannot get it out of your head after 8 centuries. And whilst poets and storytellers constructed that ideal world of chivalry and courtly love, the reality of the medieval warrior was far more prosaic and far more violent. Tournaments, those military contests held on specially prepared fields during the 12th and 13th centuries, were at first genuine battles in miniature, not individual duels, but general melee, in which groups of knights fought for hours until one side was routed and in flight. The combatants captured their opponents and demanded ransom. They were wounded. They were killed. They lost horses and weapons of immense value. The church banned them on several occasions. Monarchs tolerated them because they were a way of keeping their warrior class fit for actual warfare. And the knights adored them because they were their sport, their source of profit, and their stage for glory. One of the greatest jousters in history was William the Marshal, an Englishman born around the year 1146, who rose from absolute poverty to become the most powerful man in the Kingdom of England after the king. William was the 4th son of a minor nobleman, with no land of his own, and no inheritance to look forward to. he had was his body, his sword, and his skill. He took part in hundreds of tournaments across Europe, and in them he captured, according to his biographers, more than 500 knights, collecting ransoms that allowed him to amass wealth and reputation. He served as master-at-arms to the eldest son of King Henry II of England, and died in the year 1219 at the age of 70-something, having served as regent of the kingdom during the minority of King Henry III, and was considered by his contemporaries to be the finest knight in the world. His story, preserved in a long biographical poem in Old French, is one of the richest sources we have on medieval chivalric life. But the world of medieval knights cannot be understood without grasping the system that sustained them and which they themselves upheld. Feudalism, a word we now use as a synonym for an archaic and unjust system, but which, in its time, was a pragmatic solution to a very specific problem: how to organize society and defense in a world without a central state, without standing armies, without a bureaucratic administration, without enough money to pay professional soldiers. Feudalism was based on the principle of personal exchange. A more powerful lord would grant a less powerful one a fief, that is to say, land along with the peasants who worked it and the rights to exploit it. In return, the vassal swore allegiance, a solemn oath spoken with his hands clasped within those of his lord, and undertook to serve him with arms when summoned, generally for 40 days a year. This chain of oath and service extended upwards and downwards, from the king to the humblest peasant, forming a pyramid of power and obligation that was at once solid and enormously fragile, because it depended on personal loyalty, and personal loyalty could be broken. Castles were the material expression of feudal power. Their origins are more humble than the romantic imagination suggests. The earliest castles of the 10th century were not the imposing stone structures that cinema has made famous. They were wooden structures, a square tower on an artificial hill surrounded by a moat, all of it erected swiftly by the servile labor of the lord's peasants. What made them powerful was not their solidity, but their commanding position over the landscape and the speed with which they could be built. With a wooden castle, a territory could be controlled within weeks. That was enough to take possession of the land. But wood burned, and enemies learnt to burn the castles. So throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, the most powerful lords began to rebuild their castles in stone. First the keep, the heart of the castle, the last stronghold to retreat to if the rest fell. Then the walls, higher, thicker, with towers at the corners to strike the attackers from multiple flanks. Then the machicolations, the drawbridges, the water-filled moats, the barbicans. The medieval castle in its prime was an architectural war machine of enormous complexity. Think of the castle of Carcassonne in the south of France, whose double walls, with over 50 towers, rise today above the modern city like a stone dream. Restored in the 19th century by the architect Viollet-le-Duc, or the Welsh castles built by Edward I of England between 1283 and 1295 to consolidate his conquest of Wales, Harlech, Beaumaris, Caernarfon, Conwy. The latter are considered by specialists to be the finest concentric castles of the medieval world, masterpieces of military architecture representing the pinnacle of castle building art. Within those walls lived a complex community. The lord and his family in the main tower, his knights and squires in adjacent barracks, the servants in the service buildings, the animals in the stables, a chaplain to attend to spiritual needs, sometimes a doctor, or at least someone with a rudimentary knowledge of herbalism, a chapel where the community gathered to pray, a great hall, the social heart of the castle, where the Lord administered justice, received his vassals, organized feasts and poetry tournaments on winter evenings. Life in the castle was uncomfortable by our standards. Cold, damp, noisy. But it was life, and it was organized life, with its rhythms, its hierarchies, its pleasures and its sorrows. And in the surrounding countryside, the vast majority of the medieval population, the peasants, the villagers, in medieval terminology, not in the moral sense of the word, but in the literal sense, the inhabitants of the village, the town. It was they who sustained everything. With their labor, with the sweat of their brow, with the grain they extracted year after year from exhausted soil that had to feed everyone. The system of serfdom bound them to their lord's land. They were not slaves in the strict sense. They had some rights. They could own property. They could marry without permission. They could take their cases to court in certain instances, but they could not leave. The land was theirs in the sense that they worked it and depended on it, but it belonged to the Lord in the sense that he owned it and derived his income from it. The life of the medieval peasant was organized by the cycles of nature and the church, which, for him, were practically one and the same. The agricultural calendar and the liturgical calendar were so intertwined as to be inseparable. Sowing in spring coincided with Lent, a time of fasting and purification, spiritual preparation, just as the earth prepared itself to receive the seed. The autumn harvest was accompanied by the feasts of All Saints and All Souls. Winter, a time of darkness and cold when the earth lay dormant, was also the season of Advent and the anticipation of Christ's birth. Everything made sense. Everything fitted together. The medieval universe was a coherent whole in which the spiritual and the material, the sacred and the profane, touched one another at every moment of the day. That coherent universe had been intellectually constructed by a long philosophical and theological tradition. And in the 13th century, that tradition reached its zenith in the figure of an extraordinary man, Thomas Aquinas. Born around the year 1225 at the castle of Roccasecca in southern Italy, into a noble family, he was sent as a child to the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino, the very same founded by Saint Benedict himself. He went on to study at the University of Naples. Then, to the scandal of his family, he entered as a novice into the new order of preachers, the Dominicans. Thomas Aquinas was one of those rare spirits who appear once or twice a century and change everything. The Dominicans, founded by Saint Dominic of Guzman around the year 1215, were something new in the Christian world. Not contemplative monks who withdrew from the world, but mendicant friars, preachers who lived amongst the people, who possessed very little, who taught in the squares and at the universities. Together with the Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi around the year 1210, the Dominicans represented a new spirituality, closer to the gospel, more devoted to the poor, more committed to the real world and its problems. Francis of Assisi is perhaps the most beloved spiritual figure of the medieval West. That young man from a wealthy family in Umbria, Italy, who one day heard a voice in the little church of San Damiano saying to him, "Repair my house, for, as you see, it is falling into ruin." And he first interpreted those words literally, laying stones with his own hands to repair the ruined building, and then in a spiritual sense, founding a brotherhood of poor men who preach joy and love for all God's creatures, including birds and wolves. The life of Francis of Assisi is one of the great poems in action in human history. But let us return to Thomas. Thomas Aquinas spent his adult life teaching in Paris and Naples, writing tirelessly, producing a philosophical and theological work of such scope and depth that it still astounds us today. His principal work, the Summa Theologica, is a monumental attempt to reconcile the Christian faith with the philosophy of Aristotle. For by the 13th century, the complete thought of the great Greek philosopher had reached Western Europe. through Arabic and Hebrew translations produced in Islamic Spain and Sicily. And that thought called into question some fundamental aspects of the Christian worldview. Thomas did not shy away from the problem. He faced it head on. For years he studied Aristotle with an almost obsessive intensity, commenting on him page by page, arguing with him, learning from him. And then he wrote the Summa, in which he demonstrated, is greater than, or attempted to demonstrate, that reason and faith do not contradict, but complement one another. That reason can reach certain limits by its own power to comprehend the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, the difference between good and evil, and that faith takes man beyond those limits, is greater than to the mystery of the Trinity, to the incarnation of Christ, to grace. It was a bold synthesis, and was immediately challenged by many of his contemporaries. But it stood the test of time and became the backbone of Catholic philosophy for centuries. At the very time when Thomas was teaching in Paris, universities were flourishing throughout Europe. Medieval universities are one of the most original and enduring institutions that the Middle Ages bequeathed to the world. Is greater than. They emerged in the 12th century as associations of teachers and students, guilds in the medieval sense of the word, organized groups with their own statutes, the right to elect their own authorities, the right to confer academic degrees. Bologna, in northern Italy, was the first, founded around the year 1088 and specializing in law. Paris, which emerged in the 12th century around the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, was the leading center for theology and philosophy. Oxford and Cambridge in England, Salamanca in Castile, Padua in Italy, Prague in Bohemia. By the year 1400, there were more than 50 universities in Europe, and they were changing the world, producing lawyers, doctors, theologians, civil servants, all the intellectual cadres that increasingly complex medieval society required. Medieval university students are a chapter unto themselves. Young people from all over Europe who traveled hundreds of kilometers to study with a famous master. They lived in precarious conditions, in noisy, cold hostels, paying their landlords with the money their families sent them months late, which often arrived late or not at all. They ate poorly, slept on straw mattresses, copied their books by hand because printed books would not exist until the 15th century. And they studied using the scholastic method, the Lexio, the annotated reading of an authoritative text, followed by the Quaestio, the question raised by that text, and the Disputatio, the structured debate in which a teacher and his pupils argued for and against until reaching a conclusion. It was a method that valued argument over assertion, reason over brute authority. And it was that method, more than any other, that paved the way for the scientific revolution that would come 2 or 3 centuries later. Now return, very slowly, from the lecture halls of Paris or Bologna to the outside world, to the streets of medieval cities that began to grow and buzz with life from the 11th century onwards. The cities of the early Middle Ages had been small and few in number, but from around the year 1000, with a warmer climate, more abundant harvests, a growing population and trade reviving, the cities grew with a new and chaotic energy. Merchants grew rich. Artisans organized themselves into guilds, these trade associations that regulated production, set prices, guaranteed quality, and protected their members. Italian bankers, the Florentines, the Genoese, the Venetians invented new financial instruments, the bill of exchange, credit, double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed money to be moved over great distances without physically transporting it, paving the way for international trade. Venice is a story in itself. Literally built on water, on 100 or so islets in a lagoon in the northern Adriatic, Venice had no land to cultivate nor mineral resources to exploit. It had only the sea and its intelligence, and with that it built one of the most powerful commercial empires in medieval history. Its ships, the galleys that plied the Mediterranean in search of spices from the east, silk and gold, slaves and jewels, transformed the city into one of the richest and most beautiful in the world. In the year 1204, the Venetian fleet played a decisive role in the sacking of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, bringing tons of treasures back to the city on the Adriatic, including the 4 gilded bronze horses that still adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica today. It was outright plunder, but it was also the result of decades of political and naval skill that no other European power could match. The Crusades, that word steeped in history, of violence and religious fervor, cannot be omitted from any account of the Middle Ages. There were 8 major military expeditions, organized between the years 996 and 1291, with the stated aim of reconquering the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and the holy places of Christianity from the hands of Islam. But they were also, simultaneously, a mass phenomenon unprecedented in medieval history, a popular movement of astonishing proportions that mobilized tens of thousands of people from all walks of life, not only knights, but also peasants, women, children, the elderly, and beggars. It all began at the Council of Clermont in November of the year 1095. Pope Urban II, standing in an open field, for no cathedral was large enough to contain the crowd that had gathered to hear him, addressed a speech to the Knights of France, the exact content of which we do not know, for the chronicles that recorded it are all later and all differ, but whose effect we know with certainty. The crowd responded by shouting "Deus, lo vult," God wills it. And from that cry, simple and terrifying, the First Crusade was born. In the year 1096, the Crusader army, a motley crew of knights from northern France, Normandy, Flanders, and southern Italy, marched through the Balkans towards Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, who had sought military aid from the Pope against the Seljuk Turks, watched this human tide arrive with a mixture of relief and terror. It was not exactly what he had asked for, but he had no choice. He negotiated as best he could and sent them towards Asia Minor. What followed was a 3-year campaign of incredible hardship. The Crusaders crossed the Anatolian desert in the height of summer, dying of thirst and heat. They besieged Antioch for 8 months in appalling conditions. And finally, in the month of July, in the year 1099, they took Jerusalem. The massacre that followed the capture of the city was one of the darkest episodes of the Crusades. Crusader chroniclers described it with an enthusiasm that today fills us with horror. Thousands of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were murdered in the streets, in the mosque, in Solomon's temple. The city was drenched in blood in the name of God. The kingdom of Jerusalem that was subsequently established was an extraordinary and fragile political entity. A Christian state in the heart of the Islamic East, surrounded by enemies, dependent on a constant flow of reinforcements and money from Europe. To defend it, the military orders emerged, one of the most original institutions of the medieval world. The Knights of the Hospital of St. John, founded in the early 12th century, the Knights Templar, founded around the year 1119, and the Teutonic Knights, founded in the late 12th century. They were monks and warriors at the same time. They had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, just like any Benedictine monk, but also vows to defend pilgrims and the holy places with arms. Ora et labora became ora et pugna. Pray and fight. The Knights Templar are the most fascinating and the most controversial of these orders. During their 2 centuries of existence, they amassed wealth, power, and influence throughout Europe. They developed a banking network that allowed pilgrims to deposit their money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land. They built castles all along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean and were the most feared warriors of their time. And then, in the year 1307, King Philip IV of France, desperately in debt to them, destroyed them in a political move of brutal audacity. He ordered their simultaneous arrest throughout France in the early hours of Friday, the 13th of October that year, a detail that has fueled centuries of superstition about Friday the 13th. Under torture, the Templars confessed to heresies and aberrations they had most likely never committed. 7 years later, Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned alive on an island in the Seine opposite Notre Dame de Paris, and the order was suppressed. The history of the Templars is a story of greatness and injustice which even today, 800 years later, continues to fascinate novelists, historians, and conspiracy theorists. But the legacy of the Middle Ages is not merely martial or spiritual. It is also artistic, profoundly, astonishingly artistic. Think of medieval tapestries, those fabrics woven from wool and sometimes silk threads that hung on the walls of castles and palaces, insulating against the cold whilst decorating at the same time. The most famous of all, the Bayeux tapestry, is technically not a tapestry, but an embroidery. A strip of linen nearly 70 meters long, covered with images narrating the Norman conquest of England in the year 1066. It is a narrative work of art of extraordinary vitality, full of galloping horses, flying arrows, and falling men. It is the oldest comic in the history of Western and speaks with the same immediacy today as it did on the day it was embroidered, probably in the final decades of the 11th century. Or let's think of the frescoes that covered the interior walls of medieval churches. In Catalonia, at the National Art Museum in Barcelona, you can now admire some of the best preserved cycles of Romanesque painting in the world, carefully removed from the small churches of the Pyrenees in the 20th century to save them from neglect and the elements. The ochre and blue backgrounds, the stylized figures with their wide open eyes, the robes with geometric folds, the hieratic gestures. This is not art that seeks naturalism. It seeks something else, the presence of the sacred within the stone, the transmission of a truth that the eye cannot see but the heart recognizes. And then there are the stained glass windows of the Gothic cathedrals. The southern rose of Notre Dame de Paris, built around the year 1258, is a disc of colored glass over 13 meters in diameter, in which 80 figures of saints and prophets surround the central image of the Virgin and Child. when the afternoon sun shines through it, the interior of the cathedral is flooded with blue, red, and golden light, with an intensity that completely transforms the character of the space. It is no longer simply a large stone room. It is a place where the material becomes translucent, where the light coming from outside is transformed into something that exists only there within. At that moment, within those walls, it is an experience that no photograph can capture. You have to experience it for yourself. Medieval music also deserves its moment in this story. In addition to Gregorian chant, which remained at the heart of the official liturgy, the 12th century saw the emergence of polyphony, music in which several voices sing different melodies at the same time. The earliest polyphonic experiments, organum, date back to the 9th century, but it was at the school of Notre Dame in Paris, with composers such as Léonin and Perrotin, active in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. That polyphony took its first great leap towards complexity. Perrotins viderunt omnes, composed around the year 1215, is a work for 4 voices that intertwine in combinations of astonishing sophistication for its time. To listen to it today is to feel that time collapses and that 8 centuries are not so many. And there is something else that the Middle Ages bequeathed to us, which we rarely mention when we think of that period: gastronomy. Not in the sense of the cuisine of the poor, which was simple and meager: bread, pulses, a little pork and fish on feast days, but in the sense of the cuisine of the elites, which was elaborate, spicy, aromatic, surprisingly sophisticated. The great medieval banquets in castles and courts were spectacles designed to display wealth and power, with dishes that blended sweet and savory, tart and spicy flavors in combinations that seem exotic to us today, but which had their own logic. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, were items of extraordinary luxury, brought from Asia via long trade routes and resold at exorbitant prices by Venetian and Genoese merchants. Those who could afford to cook with spices thereby demonstrated their standing in the world. Spices smelled of wealth. They smelled of the East. They smelled of something greater and more mysterious than the everyday world of the village and the countryside. That longing for the East, for the distant, for the exotic, is also one of the driving forces of the Middle Ages. In the year 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian named Marco Polo set off with his father and uncle for the Far East, following the routes that Italian merchants had opened up to the Mongol Empire. He traveled for 24 years. He reached China, to the court of the great Khan Kublai. He governed Chinese provinces on behalf of the great Khan. He saw things that no European had seen before, or at least none who had told of them. When he returned to Venice in the year 1295, nobody recognized him. He had been away so long that his family had to examine the clothes he brought in his trunks to find the precious gems sewn into the linings, proof of the wealth he had amassed. A few years later, captured by the Genoese in a naval battle, he dictated his memoirs in prison to a writer named Rustichello of Pisa. The resulting book, Il Milione, The Million, was one of the most widely read books of the late Middle Ages and fired the imagination of Christopher Columbus 200 years later. There is something poetic about that, in the fact that the dreams of a Venetian merchant locked up in a Genoese prison have traveled through the centuries to reach the eyes of a Genoese sailor who one day decided to sail westwards to reach the east, of which Marco Polo spoke, and who, in that decision, found something completely different. The connected world we live in today has roots that stretch back to that book, dictated in a prison cell, to those dreams of spices and silks and marble cities on the other side of the known world. But the Middle Ages were not just about grandeur and adventure. They were also about disease and death. In the year 1347, the Genoese ships arriving from Crimea at the port of Messina in Sicily carried in their holds, without knowing it, the most terrible thing Europe had known since the barbarian invasions: the plague, the Black Death. In the space of 4 years, between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Western Europe. Figures the mind cannot fully comprehend. Perhaps 25 million people. In some places, the death toll was even higher. Florence lost more than half its inhabitants during those years. Cemeteries filled up so quickly that the dead had to be thrown into mass graves. Priests fled from the dying for fear of contagion. Cities emptied. Fields lay uncultivated. Social order, hierarchy, custom, everything was shaken. And yet, something was also born of that horror. Giovanni Boccaccio himself, who lived in Florence during the plague and saw people dying all around him, described the epidemic with terrifying realism in the prologue to his Decameron, a collection of 100 tales told by 10 young people who had taken refuge from the plague-ridden city in a country villa on the outskirts. The Decameron is a book about survival and joy in times of catastrophe. His stories are often comic, sometimes erotic, always full of a vitality that seems to respond directly to the omnipresent death. Live well, laugh, love, tell stories. The world may collapse, but human intelligence and human humor remain. It is an admirable response. The Great Plague epidemic of the 14th century also marked the beginning of the end of the period we call the Middle Ages. Not because the death of so many people destroyed medieval civilization, but because it changed the material and social conditions in which that civilization existed. The survivors found themselves in a world with fewer hands to work and the same fields to cultivate, which gave them a bargaining power they had not previously possessed. Peasants' revolts multiplied in the second half of the 14th century. In England, in France, in Flanders, peasants rose up against their lords, demanding better conditions. Personal freedom is greater than an end to serfdom. Many of these revolts were brutally crushed, but something had changed. The classical feudal world, the world of lords and serfs, was beginning to slowly dissolve. And as that world dissolved, another was emerging in Italy. The Italian cities, enriched by Mediterranean trade, had, since the 12th century, developed an urban and secular culture that differed from the feudal culture north of the Alps. Their wealthiest families, the Medici in Florence, the Visconti in Milan, the Sforza, the Este, were patrons of artists and scholars, and the scholars of 14th century Italian cities began to look back to ancient Rome and Greece with a newfound admiration, with a desire to recover something that time had buried under centuries of medievalism. Francesco Petrarca, born in 1304, was perhaps the first to articulate that desire explicitly. His writings in classical Latin, dedicated to the great writers of antiquity, especially to Cicero, have something of a visit to the grave of a loved one about them. He longs for those dead men. He considers them more alive, more are authentic than many of his contemporaries. And in that longing, in that project to revive antiquity, lies the seed of the Renaissance. But that is another story. Tonight, in this tranquil twilight, we linger on the threshold. We look back towards that world we have just traveled through together. The monasteries with their scent of incense and parchment, the silent cloisters where the morning light draws rectangles on the stone floor, the knights in their armor gleaming in the summer sun before the tournament, the squires adjusting their helmets with nervous hands, the cathedrals rising against the grey sky, with their flying buttresses like outstretched arms, their stained glass windows that turn light into a miracle. The universities where young people from all over Europe debate Aristotle and God, whilst the north wind rattles the windows. The merchants crossing the Alps with their mules laden with spices. The troubadours singing of the unattainable lady beneath the stars of Provence. The peasants sowing in spring and praying for the rain to come in time. The children learning the alphabet in monastic schools, forming their first clumsy letters on wax tablets. The Middle Ages were not a parenthesis of darkness between two moments of clarity. They were a world in their own right, with their beauty and their cruelty, with their faith and their violence, with their love of beauty and their acceptance of death, with its tireless search for meaning in a universe that felt ordained from above. Coherent, full of meaning even in its moments of greatest pain. A world that built cathedrals for the glory of God and castles for the glory of power, that preserved ancient knowledge and created new knowledge, which loved and waged war and prayed and dreamed with an intensity that we can still feel today when we pause before its stones, before its illuminated manuscripts, before its 8-century-old songs that still vibrate in the air as if they had been sung this very afternoon. Close your eyes. Listen. Somewhere far away, on the other side of the centuries, a bell is tolling deeply, slowly, marking the service of Compline, the last prayer of the day. The monks file silently through the cloister towards the church, their dark robes brushing the stone floor, their serene faces in the light of the candles. Outside, above the monastery's rooftops, the stars begin to appear one by one in the night sky. The world sleeps. The Middle Ages sleep. And so do you, little by little, without haste. You can let your eyes grow heavy, let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your thoughts dissolve like the mist rising from the river at dawn. There is nothing to do now. There is nowhere to go. Only this silence, this soft, welcoming darkness, this still moment between the day and sleep. History is still there, preserved in the stones, waiting to be told again tomorrow. Tonight is a time for rest. Sleep well.
Release the tension in your forehead. Relax the muscles around your eyes. Let your arms rest completely, heavy and warm at either side of your body. Your breath now flows naturally, like gentle waves lapping at the shore and receding effortlessly. The stories you have heard tonight slowly fade away, becoming distant whispers that you no longer need to follow. If this journey through time has served you well, you can support this space by liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts in the comments. That way, more people seeking rest may find refuge here. And if you are still awake, there is another story waiting in silence, ready to guide you deeper into sleep. But for now, let the voices of the past fade gently away. Let the names, dates, and events melt into the mist of the night's oblivion. The story can wait until tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let go of everything. Rest deeply, and may you have sweet dreams.